Travel and Things presents In Conversation With. I'm your host, David Batsoffen, and today my guest is author and, dare I say it, prison escapee, Tim Jenkin. Tim, how are you doing?
Very well, David. Very well indeed. Thank you.
Now, we don't find you in a cell any longer. Where are you currently?
Well, my workroom here is a kind of a cell as well, I guess, in Cape Town, in sight of Table Mountain, which I spend a lot of time climbing these days.
Wonderful. Tim, tell me, firstly, thank you for joining me, and thank you for a rather ripping read. Everything I wanted to know about key making, described in one book.
Well, it'll turn you into kind of locksmith, but not all sorts of keys. We'll help you get out of prison if you ever need to do that.
Yeah, hopefully not. So take us back. Firstly, when I got this copy of the book, I kept looking at the cover and thinking, I know this face, and this face, unless I'm very much mistaken, is Daniel Redcliffe, who was Harry Potter. And I thought, but hang on a second, either I'm missing something here. So I phoned the publishers and I said, why Daniel Redcliffe? And they said, it's now a movie. Now, somewhere in our lives, Tim, we're all asked, if they make a movie of your life, who would you like to play you? Now they've made a movie of your life, or part of your life anyway. And young Daniel Redcliffe is that person. Did you have any say in who played you? Or are you excited about Daniel playing you?
No, I had, I am excited that he played me, yes, for sure. But I had no say in that, you know. In fact, it was a few years ago when the producers phoned me up and they said, oh, we got some good news, Tim. You won't believe who we've got to play you. So I said, oh, okay, who is it? And they said, Daniel Radcliffe. And I said, well, who's he, you know? Because I didn't know, you know, I had no interest in Harry Potter and never seen the movie. And so I didn't even know who he was. But then I quickly looked it up and then I realized he was the right guy, you know. But also in my mind, I had this picture of Harry Potter, you know, a young school kid.
Yeah.
But then with a little bit more research, I found out that he's at that time was exactly the same age as me when I was doing this stuff.
Yeah.
Back in the 1970s, yeah.
In fact, you and I share a very specific date, which is 15th of June, 1978, which is the date that you were sentenced to jail. 15th of June just happens to be my birthday.
Oh, really? Okay.
So you were going to jail and I was celebrating a birthday.
Okay, well, cheers. Yeah, great.
So take us back. Tell us a bit about Tim Jenkin, who you were then, what put you in jail, and we'll pick it up from there.
Well, as the book describes, you know, I grew up as a regular, normal, racist South African. I had, on leaving school, I had not a single political idea in my head. And it was only when I went abroad to do a sort of a gap year after high school that I realized that I knew nothing about my country. You know, I started to see documentaries and movies on television. And South Africa didn't even have television at that time. So I started to see things and read books and speak to people. And many people asked me, well, you know, what's going on in your country? What's this apartheid thing about? And I didn't even really know the meaning of that word. You know, it's not something that we used back home. And even when I saw these films, I thought, oh, this is all just propaganda. You know, who's making this stuff? I've lived there all my life, never seen any of this thing. So it's only when I made a little bit of an effort to find out. And then I came back to South Africa and enrolled for a sociology degree at the University of Cape Town. And I met other students who were also curious about what was going on in our country. And our course really took us out into sort of black areas, as it was then. And I saw for myself what it was all about. And in fact, you couldn't even get into many of these areas. You needed a permit as a white person. And so it was like discovering this whole other world in my world. You know, I didn't know about all this stuff. Never thought where all these workers came from and where they went at the end of the day. So it was a bit of a shock, you know, and then spent 3 years at university. And I was very disappointed with the course that the sociology, and I was doing economics as well. And what they were teaching us didn't seem to correspond with reality. You know, they were sort of telling us that if anything happened in society, it was always something from the outside, a bit like what we have at the current time. If you get sick, it's like a strange virus coming from another country. And as far as I could see, you know, all the trouble in the country was because of apartheid itself and the living conditions that people lived under. So you didn't need to say, oh, it's nasty communists or terrorists coming from somewhere else. And so I started to look at things and to study the situation. And I met my fellow partner in crime who went to prison with me. And we decided to travel abroad, go back to Europe to try and find out more about the history of the country and the liberation movements and the struggle that we'd been reading about. And we ended up in London and met a lot of people from different parties and political persuasions, and eventually came across the ANC. And they seemed to be the group that was most active. And we went to a lot of meetings and so on, and they gave us stuff to read. And eventually we were going back to South Africa, and they said to us, well, would you guys be prepared to do something, you know? And so we said, well, what do you mean by do something? And so they explained and said, you know, as white people, even though this is essentially a black struggle, you're actually an amazing advantage over black people because you can do things that they can't, such as, you know, buy equipment and run a print shop and rent premises and so on, that ordinary black people couldn't do. So that sounded very exciting. We decided to do that. You know, we felt we just couldn't go back to South Africa and live our normal lives as white South Africans and just pretend there was nothing happening in our lives. So that's what happened. We set up I suppose you could call it a propaganda cell, which was really just the two of us. And we started producing leaflets and posting them. And we had this device called a leaflet bomb. It's not really a bomb, it's just an exploding thing that threw the leaflets up in the sky, as you saw in the film. But of course, what, you know, today when you look at it, you think, how could you have been given 12 years just for distributing some leaflets? But you must remember at that time you were doing it in the name of a banned organization, and that was taken very, very seriously, you know. So we were doing that for 2.5 years approximately. And eventually the cops got onto us, and cut a very long story short, we were arrested, interrogated, and eventually sentenced. I was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment. And then we ended up in Pretoria prison, which was at that time was the political prison for white male political prisoners. This is the era of apartheid, so each group had their own political prison. Yeah.
You couldn't even mix in prison.
No. There was no mixing. So even the staff were entirely white. So we never saw a black person at all.
Tim, the day you were sentenced, when the judge said 12 years, what is that moment like?
Well, it didn't really come as a surprise because, you know, we'd been, part of our training was how to deal with interrogation and how to deal with arrests and how to understand your sentence and about a year before we were arrested, some other guys were arrested in Cape Town for doing pretty much the same thing as what we'd been done. And they were sentenced to 8 and 10 years imprisonment. And we knew that ours would probably be longer than that, because they have this formula that if that sentence didn't deter you, then we have to up it a bit, So I wasn't surprised at all for 12 years. But it came as a bit of a shock. But, even on the date of our sentence, we had already started planning our escape. In fact, virtually from the day of our arrest, we just knew that we were not going to accept whatever sentence they gave us. And my colleague or comrade at that time, he attempted to escape on the second day of his arrest. He pretended that he was not feeling well, and they took him to the doctor, and he noticed the window was open. He dived out. Unfortunately, he landed quite hard, and he stumbled, and they pointed guns at him. So, and then while we were awaiting trial at Paulsmoor Prison here in Cape Town, we were still awaiting trial, so not sentenced prisoners were allowed to have visits and food parcels and so on. And we managed to smuggle in some money, which we hid inside cigar tubes and inserted that inside our bodies. I won't go into any more detail.
There are only 2 orifices, and one you can't put it in. The other one,
I suppose you can't really put it in there. So. And we read this book called Papillon, a very famous escape novel, or not novel, it's supposed to be a true story.
Yeah.
And it's also been made into a film. And that gave us a lot of insight. This book is really a manual of escape, how to do it, what attitudes to adopt, and how to approach the whole program. But
that prison was on an island, if I remember correctly.
Yes, he was. So he was a serial escaper.
Yeah.
And he did manage to get off the island, but then got recaptured many times. And I don't know, it's like 5 or 6 different escapes. And each one he learned the tricks from the previous one.
I suppose so. I can see publishers pulling Papillon now from prison libraries, just in case somebody else here watches this and goes, let's see if the library has that manual. But they could use, given that, I mean, we spoke a moment ago, Escape from Pretoria. It's published here in South Africa by Jacana, who publish a lot of wonderful books. But maybe this is now the new 21st century manual for getting out of prison, although I should imagine subsequent to you guys leaving, they've changed the locking systems, and they're probably all no longer mechanical. They're probably electronic now.
Well, I'm not sure about that. When I was researching for this new version, I did a search for South African prisons, and there are quite a lot of pictures, and they still seem to be using the same old locks. And in fact, Alex Mumbaris, who was the 3rd prisoner who managed to escape, he went back there about 10 years ago just to have a look. And he took some photographs, and I have those photographs, and you can still see it's the same old locks. But they may have put in a few more electronic doors, a section to block off sections and stairways and things like that.
So the doors closed behind you at Pretoria Central, and no sooner have they closed than you decide, all right, so let's see if we can open them. And then your book becomes almost a manual for do-it-yourself locksmithing 101.
Yes.
Did you have, before you went to jail, Tim, did you have any idea that you could become a locksmith? Did you have woodworking skills, or was this just something that you figured?
No. I did have those skills. At school in those days, you could still do useful subjects like woodworking and metalworking. So, and also as a kid, I was used to love making models and things. And my father had a very well equipped workshop at home. So I knew about tools and how to use them. And also I was very curious as a kid and opened locks, you know, to see what was inside of them. So I had a vague idea of how they worked. And so I wasn't just looking at a blank sort of a box and wondering what's inside there. I knew what was in there. So I knew what I was dealing with. And
Now,
these were very big locks, so much easier to manipulate.
you have two of the keys with you. You showed them to me just before we started our chat. Would you share that with the viewers?
Yes, I certainly would. So this one here was what we call a key number 1. So this was the first key. It's wood, but you can see it's quite big. And the way it's constructed, it's extremely strong. I mean, people say, how can wood open a lock? But it's made from 3 pieces. So this top piece here is the handle. And then this is what we call the shaft. And then this top bit here, the crucial bit, is what you call the bit. And the grain runs in different directions. The shaft, the grain of the wood is running that way. And this bit, the grain is running that way. So it can't snap off, and it's glued into there. So it's actually very, very strong. And even when we came to break up the keys we'd used, we had to use a chisel. They were so strong to break them apart. The second key was this one. It's a different kind of a contraption. This was used to open the door because it had the keyhole on the outside. But you could, excuse me, you could stick your hand through a little side window, and this was mounted on the end of a broomstick. So it was hanging on the end of a broomstick, and then with a mirror, you could push this through the window and then around the door, and then it would fit into the keyhole, and then you would crank it around like this with the broomstick. So that could open it.
I'm amazed at your ingenuity of figuring this all out. But I suppose if you're sitting in a cell with nothing else to do, and you have the propensity for building things, then this is an easy expansion on the original key in order to overcome those sort of things.
Yes, and people often ask, you know, how did you get dimensions for the key? Because if you look at that, it's fairly complex. But when you break it down, most of those dimensions you can get from the lock itself. So if you imagine that round bit is going into the keyhole, so the keyhole is the shape. So when you're cutting this bit of wood, it's just got to fit in the keyhole and it's got to go right through the lock. So you've got all those measurements. So the height of this thing, let me just move this so I can see it myself. The height of this bit here, we determined from looking inside the lock, you could see where this thing had turned inside the lock and left some scrape marks. And so obviously that is the measurement from the middle of the key, from the axis of where it turns to the height of the key. And then if you look at the key, you can see it's a symmetrical shape and there are 5 cuts in there. So if you've already got the outside measurement, the height of them, it's just the relative heights of those middle ones. And 2 of those are the same. So it's really just the one measurement, and you break it down like that. And simply by looking at their lock, you can estimate how deep those are. And because it's wood, you can just keep filing and filing until it works.
And I suppose the beauty of this whole thing is, again, you have the time. So
you have so much time. But I mean, I made that within a week. I had that made.
Right.
So
but it took you 2 years to escape, did it not?
I beg your pardon?
It took you 2 years.
It took us 2 years, well, 18 months to get out of the prison. So within a week, I'd made that first key. And then, as I said, the second one was much more difficult because the keyhole was on the outside. So it took us a long while to figure out how to do this. You know, it wasn't obvious. But once we hit on this idea of the broomstick, then it was fairly quick. But that still took a few months to get that correct. It was a very, very complex shape, as you can see from the key itself.
Yeah, that number 2 is definitely a lot more difficult. Now, for people who don't know, you were in that Pretoria prison with some icons, can we call them that?
Yes.
Legendary comrades that spent time with you and either were supportive of, or come on, do you really think you can do this type of people?
Yes.
I know Dennis Goldberg was in there with you.
Yes.
And then eventually, although he wasn't a comrade, Eshel Rudy pitched up in that prison as well.
Yes, but he wasn't in ours. He wasn't in our
No,
section.
no, he was there for a different reason.
Yes, yes.
But talk to me a bit about the comrades that got there before you and how they perceived you and Steve and Alex.
Yeah, well, so there were 8 of us, eight prisoners there when we arrived, so we made 10. And of course, the very first thing we spoke about was the opportunities for escape, and they just sort of laughed at us and said, you know, this is not a toy prison. It's a prison inside a prison in a complex. So even if you manage to dig a hole or a tunnel or blast a hole in the wall, and you get out of the prison, you just land up in another prison. So it's a bit like those sort of Russian dolls, you know, you take one and you get into another one. And they said, you know, there's only one exit from this prison, and that is the front door of the prison, and no other gates or walls or anything. And we're on the first floor, so there's no opportunities for digging a tunnel. And you can't blast a hole out of the wall, because when you go through that wall, you'll fall to your death, you know. So,
aside from the fact that where you're going to get the dynamite to blow up a wall.
Yeah, where are you going to get the dynamite, you know. And you can't get out through the front door because that's in the admin section, and there's an infinite number of doors that you have to pass through to get there. So it seemed a bit bleak, but our first idea was, well, if we get into the prison yard and somehow can manage to get over the wall, and there was one little place where you could get over it, and that would drop you near the front door. And even though this prison was in a bigger prison, you would sort of be in the road outside, and you could maybe walk around and get out of the complex. But after a while, we realized this couldn't possibly work because we were locked in ourselves at night. And at night, there was an armed guard watching over the yard, and there was a vicious dog in the yard as well. So those were big things you'd have to overcome. But we had some sort of plan to maybe poison the dog and distract the attention of the warden.
Or you could have done the reverse. You could have distracted the dog and poisoned the warden.
Yeah, maybe something like that. It's very difficult to get to him. He was high up on a catwalk, you know.
Yeah. Andy was armed.
Andy was armed, yes.
Yeah.
But then as we got better at making keys and opening doors, we didn't really have a plan. But each time you opened a door, you had a different view, you know. It was, we didn't know what was beyond the next door, but then managed to open one door, get out of our section, and then made a key for the admin section, just out of curiosity, see if we could do it, and managed to do that. And then slowly over time, we realized that we might be able to make keys for all of those doors down to the front door, even though it was in the admin section. At night, there was just a single guard on duty, because he was actually locked into the prison and everyone was locked in their cell. So he didn't need more than one guard in a very small prison. And, you know, he was connected by telephone and radio and everything. So if he needed backup, he could easily call it. But at night, he used to go on a walk around the prison to do an inspection. And that took him about 15 minutes. There was another part of the prison that was used for awaiting trial prisoners. So his time was often taken up in there. And during that 15 minutes, we could slip out of our cells, hide somewhere, and then he could walk past us. And then we would enter the admin section and very quickly test out the next door and the next door and the next door. And then we even realized that because he was locked into the prison, he couldn't see what we were doing if we got beyond a certain point. And that's, I mean, I'm telling a very long story in a short space, but that's what we did. So we kind of escaped many times, but not out of the prison, but all the way to the front door, and had keys all the way to the front door, which prepared us for the day of escape.
What was it like, though, wandering around this prison, opening and closing doors, originally not knowing what is behind door number 2? Is it a warder? Is it a dog? Is it a man with a gun?
Yeah.
And then realizing that you could virtually let each other out of your respective cells, wander around, opening and closing doors like Harry Houdini, and then putting yourself back into your cells and double locking doors behind you. I mean, if it wasn't for what happened at door number 10 on your escape, they would never have figured out how you got out of that prison.
Yeah, correct. Yes, well, I mean, obviously it was very scary to come out of your cells when you know there's a guard right there. But, you know, we studied his movements very carefully, and we knew his habits. And he was a very predictable guy. You know, we'd only do these things when this particular night guard was on duty, which was most of the time. He preferred to be on night duty. But we had keys for all the lockers in the workshop, so we had access to all the tools we needed, files and hacksaws and screwdrivers and everything. And we had keys to the workshops, so we could get in there virtually any time. As I said in the book, we had more keys than they did. You know, we had keys to everything. And most of the guards only had enough keys to allow them to do their job, whereas we had keys for everything.
And
every single door in the prison.
You didn't even need somebody to bring you a file in a cake. You just went and got one if you needed it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, there were files and all kinds of things in the workshop. So we could just get in there, smuggle those up to ourselves, use them at night, make the key, and then take it back into the workshop before it was opened. You know.
Do you think, Tim, that your method of escape is what sold the book as a film?
I think so. You know, it's a unique escape. If you look at all the major escape stories, people tunneled or got into air conditioning ventilators or something like that, or there was violence involved. You know, there's a lot of ones from the Second World War, and they were sort of mass breakouts, usually involving tunnels and digging. There was no opportunity for digging in our prison because, as I said, you would come up somewhere in another prison. And anyway, the yard was open and visible to the guards. So where are we going to put all the dirt that you've got? You know?
It's not like The Great Escape where you can build a vault.
No,
something to a vaulting horse.
Concrete. Yeah. So there was no opportunity for digging. You know, the only other way is like someone lands in a helicopter and takes you out.
Also wasn't going to happen back in the 70s. Your time on the road after you'd escaped, I'm glossing over that because I want people to go and buy the book or see the movie to figure out how you actually got out and hit the road, because you then went up, well, not north, you went east to Maputo. Were you sort of looking over your shoulder the whole time? Were you constantly aware that you might have been caught, that you were worried? I know you left dummies on your beds, much like they did at Alcatraz, which gave you a little bit more time to get further away from the prison. But did you believe that you were such a threat to the authorities at the time that they would start a large search for you?
Well, we did realize that would happen, and in fact, that's exactly what did happen. But the way our escape was planned was the idea was to get out of the prison without using any violence, so getting out completely secretly and without them finding out. But unfortunately, we had to damage the front door. But they only discovered that the next morning, and we assumed that would be the case because no one comes into the prison except when the day staff come on duty. So that gave us 14 hours start over them. by which time we were a long way away. And even when they discovered it, we knew it would take them a good few hours to get organized, to get the alert out, to put it on radio and television, and get our mugshots out there, and to muster their own forces. So we estimated that we had at least 12 extra hours, before they would get their forces in place. So by that stage, we were very, very far away in what was then the Eastern Transvaal, not too far from Swaziland. And then the final night, we stopped hitching and stopped showing our faces anywhere, and we simply walked for hours and hours and hours right through the night, and managed to jump over the border into Swaziland the following day. Well, that was the second day. So the first day was after the discovery of the escape, and then the next day we were in Swaziland. And then from Swaziland, we managed to make contact with the ANC there, and they concealed us and took us to the Mozambique border. We had to jump over that as well, but they picked us up the other side, and eventually we were taken to Maputo, where we stayed for about a week. And then to get us out of the way, they flew us to Luanda in Angola, just for security's sake. And then back to Lusaka, where we had a press conference in early January 1980, and then immediately flew us out to Tanzania to get as far away as possible. And that's where we had to wait until we got papers to fly to Europe, where I was in exile for 12 years, exactly the length of my sentence.
And then all sorts of, the book also goes into some detail about yourself and Robin and what did and didn't work out. And then you were also pardoned and you were able to come back to South Africa. The cops weren't waiting for you going, you Bliksem, you got away from us, you got pardoned, but we're watching you.
No, well, it was quite nerve-wracking arriving back, because we assumed that they would be watching. But, it took me a year longer than most of the other ANC leadership figures to get back, because I had to wait for that pardon. I still had this sentence hanging over my head. So it took about a year, and then eventually the pardon came through. And only the state president could issue that pardon. So by that stage, everyone else was back home. And, I was relative to them just a small fry, so we reckoned that nothing was really going to happen, and nothing did happen. When I arrived at Jan Smuts Airport, I thought, they'd start asking questions or something. But no, it was, the border control person just stamped my passport and said, welcome home, as if I had just been on holiday.
Was that not a bit of a sort of a, what's the word I'm looking for? A bit of a letdown? Did you not want, to say, the guy to say, hang on a second, I just need to clarify something, and then come back with several policemen going, Mr. Jenkin, we meet again, sir.
Yeah, a bit of an anticlimax, I guess, but great relief,
I should imagine. When people meet you now for the first time and hear your story, do they sort of look at you as you are today and go, you did what when you were younger? I remember talking to Alan Hale, who was the last surviving member of the Stander gang, and he actually spoke at a class I was teaching, and the kids couldn't believe that this elderly white man was a bank robber of note, who shot at people and escaped overseas and got away with lots of money for that time. In retrospect, they didn't steal a huge amount, but they were busy people, 4 banks a day in some cases. And here you are, with all due respect, in a similar position. You're an elderly white man, but your CV goes, escaped from prison with keys that I cut.
Yes. No, it is strange. People can't believe it. They shake their head when they read the story.
Right.
I mean, apart from the methods that we had to use, or the fact that we escaped, they can't believe that I ended up in prison for what seems now a completely trivial thing. You know, if you start your own political party or movement or anything, you can just stand at the traffic light and hand leaflets out, and most people will turn up their windows not interested, you know. So you just hand out a few leaflets and you get 12 years in prison. Then you have to go through this whole thing of getting out and putting your life at stake, you know, just for some leaflets. People think it's crazy.
But you did get a movie and a book out of it, Tim.
That's correct, yes.
I hope
a documentary, yes.
Yeah. I hope you've written to the relevant people that put you in jail going, I don't know where you are today, but I'm now a star, thanks to you.
Yeah, well, I think they, you know, I first published the book in 1987, so they learnt about it then. I've never really met anyone. I met one of the guards many years later, and he actually congratulated me. He said, "Yeah, it was brilliant. You know, it was fantastic." So I don't know. Times changed, and
they
sure a good laugh at it.
They sure have. Tim, our time is almost up. I'd just like to thank you very much. The book is called Escape from Pretoria. It's published by Jacana. The movie is out. It stars Daniel Redcliffe as Tim Jenkin. So if you want to find out more about Tim's escapades, both in and outside of prison, before, during, and after, I suggest you do either watch the movie, read the book, or do both, and then make up your own mind. Tim, thank you so much for joining me here on In Conversation With. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure chatting with you too, and good luck.